Okay, so I think we are ready to finally do a 1.9 video about ACC. There have been plenty of hotfixes in the last 2-3 weeks after the initial release, which I think is a good thing because it shows that they're really fast to adapt to whatever comes up and whatever bugs or issues are still found. And while some people complain that they never go or come with an update that's perfect, well, if you look at other games or other patches before, they either keep the issues or they take much longer to address them. So I guess there's nothing to complain really if you're fully honest. And it seems like the hotfixes have now settled, and it looks like we have the final physics more or less that we're going to have probably until the end of the ACC life cycle. So this is what we're going to stick with for quite some time. And the only thing that's probably not done is the BOP, which will still change once the esports guys go from track to track. But physics-wise, I think we can now start to draw some conclusions. And this is what I'm trying to do in this video. Of course, we're going to show the famous PDF from Ares just as a, well, rough guidance, what we're looking for. And then I'm going to show a few ideas, mainly around how you can now make cars rotate in the game. And I feel these are all options that were not possible before that update. So I think it's very crucial because everything in sim racing is always about rotating a car around the corner. And I think ACC is much better in that regard now. So let's go. So the first thing we'll have to go through then, of course, is Ara's famous PDF file where he made some notes on the physics changes that were happening to the game. I want to stress that this is how the game is intended to work, and it highlights the theory that Ares has been chasing. And of course, because there are various limitations of the engine, of the game in general, of understanding of how tires work, of implementation possibilities, or whatever. Again, treat this as a should, not necessarily as it is. Especially when you have ACC being rather popular and having quite a few very competitive esports competitions. There are people out there, quite a lot, will just by their job description essentially are trying to break the game to kind of not exploit it, but just have a faster car in the end, and that's perfectly fine. So when you're against that as a developer, then it's probably not that easy to always prevail. So with that in hindsight, that there's probably a gap between how the game should work and how the game actually work, we can, I think, just go into that PDF now. So, of course, these are physics now. And first things coming up would be their general changes to how the tire works. Part of that is how the pressures are going to be used. And while there is something to it, that you probably get a softer, more vague tire with lower pressures and a more responsive tire, both in terms of force feedback and responsiveness of the car on the track with higher pressures. And you also get tiny, really tiny, we're talking 1-2 degrees from a really low pressure to high pressure situation, but you can get temperature differences as well in the tire. I feel in terms of lap time, there isn't too much difference between, say, 26 psi, 27.5. So in terms of that, I just think you don't have to worry too much. And you rather want to think about having higher pressures if there's a track that has a lot of risk of losing pressure if you go over edges, for example. So do take the tire pressures as something rather to adjust the feeling of the car. Go a bit higher if you want to get more feedback in the steering. Go a bit higher if you want to keep pressure in the tire for longer, say on something like Olten, and go a bit lower if you want to generate temperature, for example. We were talking really tiny amounts, so I'd say the whole tire pressure thing is much less sensitive than it was in previous patches. There's allegedly some impact depending on the track layout. So if you have a really fast track, you want to use higher pressures. If you have a really slow track, you want to use low pressures. It feels like these differences are in a very subtle area there, so don't worry about the grip levels with tire pressures too much. Temperature range is roughly the same as before, 70 to 100 degrees. I don't think much has changed there. What has changed, though, is how the tire temperature develops with different camber and toe settings. Overall, there will be a bigger spread from inside to outside. The temperatures on the surface will increase and decrease faster. But in the end, it seems to me, to break it all down, that you still want to run a lot of camber, if not max camber, and you can kind of ignore the negative impact you're getting from those temperature differences, right? There is going to be more uneven wear from inside to outside. There's going to be bigger temperature differences from inside to outside, but it doesn't seem like kind of taking this more into account really offsets any negative impact you have from using less negative camber. So as far as I can tell, we're still running a lot of camber, and we're just living with a bigger spread in temperature and wear. So this is not something to ignore, but something that, again, has subtle impact, I think, on what we're doing overall, unless you're getting really extreme values. Then the more interesting stuff is coming now with tire flex and how you generate rotation in the car. The overall idea being using less camber on the rear and using positive values of toe on the rear can help rotate the rear around the corner. So essentially, the more rear camber you use, the more support you're giving the rear, the less likely it is going to rotate. The less rear camber you're going to use, the more the rear will rotate around you. And I feel the main impact of that is, while before in 1.8, when the car allowed it, you were definitely forced to using negative toe because it was just a faster option to get the car around the corner. There was an issue with the slip angles on the front and rear tires where they just weren't the same. And that allowed for this negative toe to kind of cope with the rear tire not being able to rotate. Cut things short. This is now different. And I feel that we can now work with these things to at least get the car to rotate and get it to behave more nicely. Because some of the issues with the negative toe always was, I felt, is while, of course, they're very good and the pro drivers were able to drive it, it just generally made the car more sensitive. And the sensitivity now in 1.9 is definitely increased. So these negative toe setups will be even less pleasing, even less consistent to drive for the non-pro audience, which is probably 90, 95, or 99% of players. And I think here is where the real positives of the update come in. You can now get the car to rotate, get on a similar amount of lap time. Maybe not the same. Maybe negative toe is still the faster way. It does seem like it. But you can get a nicely behaving car that should give you a much more pleasing game experience, simulation experience in general, without having infinite time loss compared to the, well, exploit or negative toe or whatever setups, okay? So this is what we're going to explore in this video, how we adjust the camber and toe to get the car to rotate. And I hope, and so far I think that, so I hope you find the same, is that we can get nice to drive cars now without relying on negative toe and getting a nicer to drive car than with negative toe. So there's a real positive about this, even if it's not ultimate lap time. The whole idea here is to, well, the new buzzword in ACC now is yaw, essentially the rear not stepping out, but leaning into the tire a bit, right? That's the movement the race drivers always do when they mean the rear steps out. It's like this, kind of, you lean onto whatever I do right here. You lean into the tire a bit, you point, you kind of look to the inside of the corner, and the rear comes around a bit. And this is, I think, a better way to express what your rotation in the end means. The car comes around a corner. Let's call it rotation. I think that's fine. There is more to have, though. If we scroll down a bit, there is a change to the suspension as well. Essentially, the issue before was the bump stop could be infinitely compressed. So the force increases, the bump stop gets smaller, 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 ever stiffer, but it never explodes or stops entirely. So it could just keep going on, and there would be very rare occasions only where the forces would entirely transmit into the chassis, giving undrivable situations. So that didn't happen, and that led to very soft suspension, often being the go-to way, paired with rather stiff bump stops to kind of keep the car somewhat drivable. And the soft suspension always led to more top speed because the car squatted more in the straight. And these things are now a bit changed because this is the reality now. There is a definitive end to the suspension travel from which any excessive forces will go into the chassis, and that is going to be shit for you while driving. So if you go over a bump like that, the car will start bouncing very badly. And that now leads to necessary changes in how you set up the suspension. Of course, there seems to be, again, the approach of people to go with the old style setup, soft suspension, bump stops, a lot of travel or little travel or whatever, to kind of produce very fast lap times. But in terms of driving experience, it does not seem right. It does not seem good. It's not fun to drive such a setup. And I feel for the majority of people, it will also be the better experience to go with a setup that now works a bit different, that really deliberately uses the springs to balance the car. And that comes with more advantages too. Now that we can use stiffer springs in the first place, we automatically get a more stiff aerodynamic platform, which comes with less pitch sensitivity under braking, and again, overall makes the cars more pleasing to drive. And we can also use the suspension to change the balance of the car in a more incremental way. I guess that's what ours is trying to say here. With a soft suspension, there will just be energy left going into the chassis with a hard stop. And with a stiff suspension, you will be able to take all the forces that are acting on the suspension during a lap and kind of still manage them before they transmit into the chassis, and therefore have a more solid driving experience where you have less sudden occurrences of issues. All that translates into force feedback because that was always tied to the tires, so I'm not going to go into that. Tiny changes there. I don't feel any issues with that. And there has been also changes to the electronics. I'm not sure they got to do all cars, but a lot of cars have changed electronics to that, which also allows us more options to create rotation. And I think this is where the key takeaway from this video is going to be, after I'm actually going through it, is we can create rotation in more ways now. We can have more pleasing to drive cars in general, and we can follow general setup guidelines more closely. So let's see how that's supposed to work. So let's now go into the game. And as a start, what I've loaded up is an old replay of 1.8. I think it was an LFM race or so in the Nissan. And if we just play it forward and actually jump a bit here, you can see, okay, while on turn in, maybe actually go back a second here because this is really, really pronounced, and make it a bit slower here, is as soon as I hit the brake, and let's view this as well, and turn it a bit slower, you can see that as soon as I hit the brake, I start committing for the corner, and the steering wheel is all the time, sorry for that stupid bar there, the steering wheel is all the time very active. I have to really control the car there. And that's because we had to set the car up so loose and sensitive on 1.8 for them to keep rotating on exit, and that usually leads to very sensitive cars into the corners. And if we roll it forward a bit now, into this long right hand on Barcelona. Into the corner, all good, the car rotates. But as soon as I'm back on the throttle, you can see how the car has no chance whatsoever to stick to the inside and still kind of push towards the outside of the corner, but there's no chance whatsoever for the car to kind of be pulled back towards the inside. And I think it's even better visible if we take the outside view a bit, go 5 seconds back, and maybe another 5 seconds and another 5 just to see the braking here as well. Maybe a bit faster. I think on the braking it's hard to see how sensitive the car is. Maybe a bit in and out of the corner there, that's all fine. But now watch how it goes into this corner. Here it rotates off the throttle, all good. And now on the power, immediately you can see the car pushing. Let's make that a bit slower and a bit better analysis even. So into the corner, you throw it in, you're really aggressive with the steering to get the car to rotate. And then you go off the throttle and you can see something like, it might be better perceived if we go into the top view, that something you will be able to see. I'm not even sure if I can't paint that. But what you're supposed to see is that there is a smaller gap between the front end and the curb, and a bigger gap between the rear end and the curb, indicating that the rear is stepping out a bit. And now let's roll forward and wait for the moment when the throttle application happens. Here, the gap's still there, and now this kind of changes to the front having the bigger gap towards the curb and the rear having a smaller gap towards the curb, just indicating that the direction the car is now facing is more towards the outside of the corner. And on a powerful car with 500, 600 horsepower onto the rear tires, who are already set up in a way that they should give maximum rotation with an aggressive aerodynamic balance, you want that rear end to still have, so to say, the wider gap towards the inside curb, meaning the rear steps out a bit and rotates the car around. And this is something on 1.8 that was a major issue, especially for the cars that were tied to zero toe, that didn't have negative toe. And it was only really possible for cars to circumvent that either with negative toe or very aggressive ways to set up the car if they didn't have the negative toe option. And that led to all sorts of issues down the line and weird setups and whatnot. So let's move to 1.9 and see if we can get the same situation and make a little comparison here. So let's go. Did a few attempts and I can already feel the impact. The setup is unchanged so far to what I showed you earlier. And you can already tell here on the corner exit and in this fast right-hander here, if I just turn more, the rear end will immediately come around. And there was something on 1.8 that just wasn't there. You were always limited in terms of what the front axle was able to do, and not so much what the rear was able to do. So we're just braking here somewhat normally. The rear is still sensitive on entries. I have to take care of it. But every time I go onto the throttle, I get the oversteer and I can roll into the corner. And if I go on throttle, now the rear just pins to the, the front just pins to the inside. And actually the rear steps out because I have so much more available now. I think I want to do this one more time just to really highlight that. Let's go for that one more time. And also what you can feel is the agility of the car, or agility of the car, is it feels a bit higher with the rear end just having a bit more room to play before reaching the grip limit there. So I can easily just take a tighter line here, get the rear round, be a little more aggressive. It's at the same speed, you're not as much run out of track while on throttle. Let's do one more time and just kind of try to get a sense visually for what the rear is doing. Again, braking, not been the issue, still sensitive into the corner. But here already I can play with the throttle to get the car around. And here into it. Now on throttle, the front the front nicely aims for the inside curve and the rear end steps out a bit. And that was something you just did not have before. So if we just go quickly for the replay here a couple seconds back, just take the same rear view maybe initially, just to see how the car responds to the corner. Off the throttle now, onto the throttle, and it does come around and you get this nice, what they now call the yaw rotation, or just a yaw in general, or we can just stick to rotation. That's completely fine. I'm also just going to view this from above to have the actual comparison to the attempt on 1.8, and let's also show the throttle inputs here. You can see now, when you have a bit of patience, car goes into the corner. We still have the same thing. We do have, well, bad to see here because of the lighting, but the rear has a bigger gap to the inside curb than the front has, indicating that the rear kind of rotates around the front end a bit and therefore brings the car nicely around the corner. Now we're rating a bit, and now we go on to power. And what was happening before is that the front end immediately started gravitating towards the outside of the corner. And now with full power applied, you can see the front kind of stays more to the inside than the rear end of the car, indicating that the car is still rotating. And that is the main thing that is different on 1.9 now. You have more room with the rear to play, and you can now set it up in different ways to make this more pleasing to drive, because obviously, as you saw, this might be a bit on the edge now. So in the next step, I'm trying to do a few changes to the setup and get the car around here in different ways than we knew was working on 1.8. Cut. So now drove a couple laps, figured a few, well, not figure it out, but just played with a few things. And before, the setup was really sensitive, edgy on the brakes, lost the traction really quickly. And the only changes I did now are to the top, just added a bit more. Not saying this is the final thing, right? Not every setup is going to look like this or so, but just giving you, just following the theory a bit here, just reducing a bit of the rear camber, adding a bit of toe to allow the rear to kind of overdrive the rear a bit and therefore rotate around. The main benefit is with this whole thing, it gives you other options that you can kind of dial back a bit that were previously giving you rotation, but it was more, so to say, rotation that came at a price, and it comes at a price even more now, which is just a drivability thing, really. So before, the rear springs were definitely a click or two stiffer, which I reduced now, which gives us better traction, gives us a bit more compliance for the rear, gives the rear overall, gives it a bit more time, makes it less aggressive, and it overall becomes more pleasing. And the target I'm chasing always with the setups is to go for an amount of rotation that is more or less the same in all driving scenarios. So if I'm on the brake, the car should rotate a certain amount. If I'm off the throttle, should rotate a certain amount. I'm on the throttle, rotates a certain amount. And those three amounts of rotation should be similar to one another. And that is something where 1.8 was really tricky, because into the corner it was way too much rotation, easy to lose the rear. And then on acceleration, it was way too little rotation. So you had a huge gap in car behavior through the different driving scenarios. And that, I feel, is something that you can get now much narrower, much closer together with the new way the game works. So I made the rear suspension a bit stiffer, made the bumps range a bit smaller to keep the aero balance under control during acceleration. But in turn, I also was able to take out some rake off the car, which should give me a bit of top speed, B, make it much more stable under braking, and with the way we can still rotate the car without a huge amount of rake, we should get an overall more pleasing to drive car. And I'm not even going into all the options we have available now, because part of this whole thing is that also the preload now is much more impactful, and you can get a car that is very stable on corner exits with very low preload. And if you have a car that just doesn't want to come around in some situations, you just add preload, and suddenly the rear end becomes more snappy, but also more likely to rotate around you. We're not even tapping into these options yet here. So I made the rear softer, reduced a bit of camber, and we're driving less rake now. And still the car will go through the corner, of course. And we can still see in this corner, easily coming around, plenty of room, don't even have to use all the steering angle I would have available. There was more on the front tires to have, but we already made it around. And now the main corner, we're not going to go too far, just a couple corners to show you the idea. Now on the braking, it will be more stable because I don't have so much rake. In the transition, it won't be as aggressive. The drift that is occurring here is not going to come as aggressive, not as killing. And I'm on the throttle, and the car just nicely goes in and out of rotation. I have so much room to play with here, and that I think is the achievement of the patch. You're now stable in the corner, on the throttle, the turbo comes, the rear comes around a bit, but it kind of talks to me 2 seconds before it actually happens, and it doesn't just step out on me. It's telling me, you know, I'm about to come around on you, the turbo's going to kick in, and then the rear steps out a bit, but it's easily manageable, and I don't really have to worry about that anymore. So I'm making the corner exits quite easily, the rear just always coming around ever so slightly to help me, but it's never going to be as much or as brutal as suddenly as in the previous patch that it overwhelms you, that it eventually is very easy to lose time. So what I'm trying to say is the rotation comes more predictably over a bigger amount of time, and is easier to control at a certain amount without being too aggressive, right? I can just be a little off here and I can still get the car around, say, okay, I want a bit more to the inside, okay, onto the throttle, and it's going to work. And the same thing, the throttle as a means of driving the car becomes more important now, has more relevance for driving around the track now, because it can help you get the car to the inside, whereas previously you either slammed the throttle to make the rear to step out, or you just had to find some way to work around the understeer on corner X, and that was all now very easy. I didn't even spend much time on it. So I think if investing the time in the setup, there's even more control to have over all these different driving situations. Let's move on though to cars that were previously using the negative toe, and if we can make that, or let's assess what the negative toe now does to the car, and if that's actually desirable, and what we can do to make the car nicer to drive. All right, guys. Now we gotta go to a car that always benefited massively from the negative toe, which is the old Porsche. Well, the old new Porsche, the 9912 Porsche. So not the latest, but the previous. Just because I had a setup there for Barcelona that was in 1.8 terms good to drive. In 1.9 turns out it still works. You can still get it around the track, but I'm after something else here. So let's have a quick view of the old setup here. So the negative toe maximum on the front, slightly reduced on the rear, helps a tiny bit. The cambers are just maxed. If we go to the suspension, the typical thing you always saw, very low wheel rates, allowing some squat on the front, nothing on the rear to keep the car in a very solid aerodynamic zone. And in terms of aerodynamics, we had pretty much rake. 20 millimeters of rake on the Porsche is quite a lot, but the way how it worked in 1.8, that was still okay, and you could achieve the lap times with it. Not a lot of splitter, maximum wing. Now we're gonna have both laps side by side right afterwards. So just for you to remember, a lot of rake, softer springs, putting the car in rather stiff bump stops, and the tires, the alignments, very aggressive, a lot of negative toe. So now let me load just the changes I did, and I took like 5 minutes. I went out, did a few changes, went out again, adjusted a bit. So really quickly, very broadly, also only after what should work now in 1.9. So what I did then is, okay, just go to kind of more normal toe values on the front. Maximum camber is still a fine thing. That's what Pirelli allows, so we're going to keep that. Just reduce the camber a little on the rear and go quite a bit of positive toe here. We're going to look into the telemetry with new telemetry channels on Popometer right afterwards. but that's just the brief changes here on the alignments. Going to the spring then, I stiffened everything up a bit, giving it a more stable aerodynamic platform. You see, I didn't really change the bump stop range on the front because that's still where the peak downforce on the front of the car is if you let it squat a bit. But added stiffer springs, which gives overall more aerodynamic stability. The car is not as aggressive anymore and doesn't respond to every input. You'll see that in the comparison right after that. Same for the rear. The initial gap, just showing you on the right side, the initial gap between the front and rear spring was just 37,000 Newton. So they were closer together. Now, when I increased the front spring, I had to have a bigger gap with the rear to still get the same amount of rotation. So from 37 kilonewton, we were going to 50 kilonewton, indicating a more a stiffness balance that is stiffer on the rear end of the car. This prevents the rear end to squat. This gives more rotation if you want to narrow down to that. At the same time, allowed the bump stop range on the rear to be a bit bigger, so we have some travel there, giving the car more compliance, making it less aggressive and responsive. Just roll bars a bit, nothing much here. I changed the preload as well, was previously 300, very aggressive, quite a bit down, because now we can afford it. We don't need that stability under braking, and we don't need that aggressive rotation, aggressive slip anymore on corner exits, so we could go down on the preload as well. And we could also change the rake quite a bit. Instead of the 20 millimeters, we only have 15 millimeters of rake, which gives overall much more stable car. Under braking, much less issues. On throttle, still having rotation and into the corners, not as sensitive. Increase the splitter in return to roughly keep the same aero balance, at least in the menu here. That's as far as the setup changes go. I can already tell you the lap times I did were almost identical. I even was faster with the kind of new setup. Not saying this is generally the case, that the new setup is the faster way. There's probably a way to make the negative toe faster or the fastest. Yeah, I think it can still work. But for me, it's about the drivability of the car, the predictability, the kind of the joy you have with it, how easy it is to drive. And I think that is where the new setup really excels in taming the car in a lot of areas. And I'm fairly sure you're going to see when we go into the side-by-side now, and then we're going to have a look at the data afterwards. So let's go for that part. So what I want you to focus on when we just go with the side-by-side in a couple seconds is first, how sensitive does the car seem under braking and turn-in? How many corrections are there you need to do? 2, how's that mid-turn? And 3, how's on exit? And maybe a fourth point would be to see how often the car goes in and out of rotation for each corner. I'll just play it forward. On the left side, you are seeing the old setup, the sensor setup. On the right side, the new one. And you can already tell under braking there's a couple more movements for the car on the left, and also over the curb on exit here. There's just more corrections every now and then. The only place where you can see here, though, the negative toe can just live with less steering angle. But here it's also more sensitive. As soon as I'm on throttle, you can see there's much more corrections needed. The car wants to go several more times. Also here under braking, much more sensitive before being able to commit to the steering. And also on exit, there are a couple more corrections. This corner should be even more tricky because of the bumps approaching it. And various more corrections there as we go onto the throttle. And then I think this is also a takeaway here. Despite the correction there, the main advantage the negative toe has is into fast corners in terms of lap time, but that's just with me having made like a 5-minute setup there. Also here you should be able to see there was one correction on the new setup, but several always on the old one, and it's just more sensitive to drive. And that's me on a direct drive wheel that tells me a lot of information all the time very quickly, easy to respond to. But I feel as soon as you're not running on a high-end wheel there, really, this can become much more of a problem driving such sensitive setups. And as you were able to see, the lap time in the end turns out quite similar, at least on this very rough test. Let's also have a quick look at the telemetry and if there's anything we can spot. You can see the left side, the slightly slow one, is on the old style setup and the slightly faster lap on the new style setup. Comparing the data means all solid lines are going to be from old style setup, max negative toe or similar, and all dotted lines are going to be from the new setup. And we're going to make this line slightly opaque, but to be honest, I think in terms of line, there isn't really a difference. So let's zoom in a bit on turn 1 to 3. And I guess over the course of the lap, there are these situations that will occur more often, well, twice, say at least, where the old setup, negative toe setup, is just much faster into high speed corners. But again, this is probably down to me not dialing in the new setup with as much time in my hand. So this might be, I might be able to fix that and still get that behavior. The main thing I'm going to be after is going down here in the steering. So again, the solid line indicating the old setup, dotted line, new setup. And you can see there are, while there are corrections on the new setup, I think especially here, and you can see where the car is driving, that's the exit of turn 2. There's a bit of a correction here, but after one correction, it's also fine. And that's very typical for the negative toe setups, that it just keeps to try again and rotate too much and try again and try again and try again. And this is what you see here. Once, correction twice, correction the third time, correction the fourth time. And the car is always so much on the edge and on the verge of getting too loose on the rear that you have to be like really, really focused on the car and how you drive it. And this probably just goes further into the right-hander as well. And on exit, we're going to see this. And I felt we were able to also see this going into turn 4 here, where on the brake, both have a bit of a correction. We can probably zoom in a bit more here even. Let's take this entire part. So we're just zooming in a little on this turn 4, and you can see, yes, there are corrections for both setups. But already in the video, we're able to see that I can, at least by the looks of it, commit a little more on the more neutral setup now. And then on exit, I think, is where you see it the most, is where the old style setup with the negative toe steps out once, perfectly settled, steps out twice, perfectly settled, steps out the third time. And I just keep being, on the very edge of my seat all the time to kind of double check that the car is staying in line there. And I'm much more scared on the throttle potentially as well there. And I think this just keeps carrying on as well in the transition here when you're going for braking into 5, where there is going to be the swing to the left, and then there's immediately following by a counter steer and another counter steer and another counter steer there for the negative toe setup. And the same thing on exit, where you constantly have the in and out of the steering, just showing how sensitive the car really is. And that pattern just keeps going into that quick chicane there as well. Very hesitant on turn in here. The rear steps out all of a sudden. Then I can commit again, steps out again, commit, steps out. And I just have to be very, very careful and patient, or reactive to the car, and pay attention all the time. I guess then we'll might be able to see this one more time in the long double apex right-hander up the hill, where here is a bit of a counter steer you don't need at all on the new style setup, and then it happens a few more times here, especially on the exit. Well, there's some issues for the no negative toe setup as well. It is just constantly trying to catch you off guard with a negative toe, and that's, I think, the point I'm trying to make here. What do we have? The last section there. We can get away with less steering angle in some situations where the car is just easier to rotate and you don't need to tap into the front tires as much. But this also tells you another thing, which I want to go on about. If we scroll down a little, we have new channels here. And let me actually resize them real quick. Maybe so that we can get them onto the same page. Sorry, it takes a couple seconds still. But now, yes, we can now see this better. So what I want to highlight here is that we probably need to zoom into T13 again, and only looking at the slip. This is a lot of noise here in the data, so you might have to zoom in even more. But I think where you can start seeing is when we are here, that is the exit of turn 2. So this area, this is what I'm trying to show you here, this area. Okay, let's go down to the slip, and you will have, it looks largely the same on the front, but you can see on the rear, there's much less slip on the adapted setup with no negative toe and less rear camber. Much more easy to go in there. And then in the fast and long right-hander, you can see differences in the wheel slip as well, where you can see now that the new setup is tapping much more into the front tire, creating more slip there, while it needs less or has less slip on the rear axle. And that should, at least looking at this data, mean that you will have more front tire wear in comparison to the negative toe setup, which means it might keep the wear imbalance a little smaller with the new style setups, which allows you over the course of the stint retain a more neutral balance and get less of a balance shift, as some people now see, especially on the Porsche. Let's check a few more places, maybe turn 4. Same thing with a tire slip. You can see I'm tapping more into the front tire more comfortably, and also having less slip on the rear here while still rotating the car around without the negative toe. That is here under acceleration. And that in the end just gives you, so feeling wise, driving wise, this is then where for you it's going to feel more stable in the end, more predictable, with both tires being more similar with the amount of slip they're tapping into. Let's see if there was any more places where we could see that, but I think the turn 2-3, 1-2-3 is very, very pronounced all the time where you get this stuff. But I think it's a constant pattern around the lap, more or less, where we can now use a bit more of the front tire while still rotating around the corner nicely, using less of the rear tire and potentially keeping the wear balance in check, while overall not having to sit on the edge of our seat all the time to keep the rear end of the car in check. All right, guys, this is going to be the end of the video. What I'm hoping to achieve here is give you an idea of more ways of getting cars around the corner now, of more ways to rotate the cars around. There are options now playing with the rear camber, with the rear toe, and with the spring balance of the car, also giving you new options in terms of aerodynamic balance. And generally, it feels to me, at least, that you can have much better feeling setups now when you go with less negative toe or none at all, less rear camber, which then allows you to have new ways to look at aerodynamic balance, not going to be as aggressive, and getting overall a more smoothed out driving experience, a smooth driving feel of the car. The car is less likely to have sudden changes in behavior. It's more likely it's more likely to have a smooth transition from grip to no grip, from slidey back to grippy, and it should overall allow you to feel more on top of the car in a bigger variety of situations instead of constantly being on the back foot and just waiting for the rear to step out. And I think this is the true achievement of the patch here. It's not that the ultimate lap time, it seems like you can still achieve that with maximum negative toe or negative toe in the first place. Doesn't have to be maximum, might still work, but that's not the main thing. In 1.8, it was impossible to have decently driving, rotating car without negative toe. And that is the thing that has changed. You now have more options to have nicely behaving cars. Well, yeah, maybe ultimately the maximum lap time you want to achieve is still in the negative toe area, but you can get fairly close now with a much nicer to drive car. And this is, I think, where 95% or even more people of the player base will benefit. They don't have to drive the hardcore esports setups now. They don't have to go for the min-max settings. They don't have to go for the negative toe and kind of feel like they need the super expensive equipment to handle it. They don't need to follow this route. They can now use different setups that make the car more pleasing to drive, but still rotating them around the corner. And I think that is the main thing that 1.9 so far seems to have achieved, that you can have nice to drive cars without losing a lot of lap time. I think that's it for now. We probably have to do a lot more 1.9 videos. There's a lot more to talk about. There's more to explore. I think we can go into more detail now with setups in general, because it doesn't seem like it needs to be as exploitative as before. And all the things that we can adjust on the car now matter a little more. We can talk about the suspension in the future. We can talk about the preload in the future more, because there's also definitely something to see in the data as well. On Popometer, we have new channels for that as well, indicating nicer what the differential does, and probably new options in terms of what we can do aerodynamically with the car. Just because we're able to create rotation in different ways now, we can usually get away with less aggressive aerodynamic balance. So yeah, there's new topics to talk about. I'm looking forward to finding the time to do it. And for now, this is the end. So like, subscribe, head over to Popometer.io to check it out, and then see you very soon.